Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Q&A about business innovation and managing life. And I see a bunch of questions here. First one I see is from Yasha, asking, what are you looking forward to most about the Wolfram Summer School this year? And asking about exciting projects you can give sneak previews of. Well, let's see. Let me explain a little bit about what we've done for the last, what is it now, 22, 23 years. We've been doing a summer school, we've called it. It's a 3-week program. Actually, it's 3+1 because there's a pre-week for some tracks. It's a summer program to kind of introduce people to the kind of foundational thinking that we've kind of developed over the years and the kind of computation as a tool for that, and to have people do some original independent project over that period of 3 weeks. And you can see all the projects that get done. They're all posted on the web. One of my main roles in the whole thing is coming up with projects for the 70-something people who will typically come to the summer school. And it's an interesting process. It's kind of an extreme version of being a professor and coming up with projects for graduate students or something like this. I should say that the people who come to our summer school are usually there's a range of people from some undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, some kind of more senior folk, some people who've been out and about in the world and so on, and the occasional high school student. Those are pretty rare, though. We have a different program for high school students. But in any case, the concept is to sort of teach people our sort of foundational way of thinking, and the big tool for doing that, kind of computational thinking with our computational language, Wolfram language. Most people who come to the summer school already know Wolfram language decently well. But to really sort of help them to do an incisive project that figures out something new and interesting. Well, in terms of actually, we've been thinking of renaming what has been called the summer school, because that sounds like a very much, we give lectures and students listen type thing. It's much more of a research experience where students get to do their own an original research project. In terms of sort of how the projects get figured out, I usually come with a big long list of hundreds of projects that I think will be interesting things to work on in a particular year. I have to say I've been a bit negligent in not writing down, making my list. In fact, this very evening I might have a chance to work on that list. Typically, throughout the course of the year, I accumulate projects where I think this will be an interesting thing to do at the summer program, and so on. And then at about this time, or usually a bit before this time, I try and make an explicit list that people can see. And then it's sort of a mixture of things from that list, things students kind of come with, of things that they're interested in, things that mentors at the summer program talk to students about. And then kind of my goal is to put all those things together and figure out what project should a particular student do. It's actually been really satisfying over the years, because I've really sort of managed to come up with projects that are interesting fits for different people. And occasionally those projects have really turned into almost career-long kinds of directions for people, which is really a satisfying thing to have been able to contribute, so to speak. So in terms of what areas there'll be lots of projects in, I should say that the summer school has a series of different tracks. So there's a kind of science and technology track. That's a kind of long-running track that's sort of been there forever. There's a track oriented towards our physics project. There's a track, I'm trying to now remember, and I'm because we these tracks are factored in different ways. There's a track that's more oriented towards my new kind of science direction and ruleology, the study of simple rules and what they do, this sort of basic area of science. There's also an education track, I think. And there's another track that we just added last year about philosophy and strategy. And each of these tracks has a slightly different collection of mentors and slightly different emphasis and slightly different populations of people who are coming. This year, I'm hoping that we'll really be able to energize a bunch of things in our physics track, because our physics project needs a bunch more person power to really move things forward and go from understanding something about sort of the machine code of the universe to understanding things about consequences for actual experiments and so on. So that's the thing that I'm keen to see pushed, along with kind of the things we're doing in infrageometry, trying to understand how to sort of remake the whole history of geometry and calculus and so on, starting from the kinds of things which are the way that space is built in our physics project. So those are a few things. I might just mention that in addition to our main summer school program, we also, starting a bit more than a decade ago, we have what's now called the Summer Research Program for high school students. We have, I think we've been a little bit victims of our own success there, because we have really a very, very large number of very good applicants for that. We have a very large number of good applicants for the summer school as well, but I think that the kind of ratio has gotten more extreme in the case of the high school program. That's a 2-week program that is also oriented towards high school students doing projects. I think this year, I seem to remember we have 77 students coming to that. And again, my role there tends to be to figure out what project should each student do. And again, lots of very interesting things have been done there. We post the results of that on the web. And we also now have a middle school program as well. That's a virtual program. Well, so that's a little bit on that. It is interesting. Our summer programs are sort of a version of what education might look like. That is different from the way education is normally done. First of all, it's really emphasizing kind of individual projects, individual original projects being done by people. That's one thing. The other thing is kind of the whole sort of story is wrapped around kind of using computational thinking as a way to formalize what one's doing, really pushing for things for kind of our style of foundational thinking and so on. I've thought quite a bit, and people have suggested, and even there are some initiatives along these lines of sort of extending what we've done with these summer programs into more of a proper sort of proto-university kind of effort. I will say that for our high school program, we have now a thing that continues into the year. It's called Wolfram Emerging Leaders Program. I have not as involved with that, but it's been a rather successful program, and we actually have a version of that for college as well. So we're sort of slowly expanding into sort of doing education, still rather small numbers of people, but it's kind of giving one a taste of what it's like to sort of be actually delivering education. Of course, I should mention that we also have Wolfram U, which is delivering mostly Wolfram language based training on all sorts of different kinds of topics. That's a completely different track that goes through our company. But it is something that's sort of an interesting problem. I suppose I mostly here talk about solutions to things, but an example of a problem that I'm trying to figure out is we have this style of thinking, this sort of foundational way of thinking about things that people seem to find very valuable. And it's the question is sort of how do you provide education about those kinds of things? And that's something we're sort of trying to figure out. What is the right kind of way to deliver that? Who are the people who are most going to care about that? How should it best work? And is it people who are sort of grown-ups who want to learn more? Is it people who are sort of between high school and college? Is it people at different stages? Where is it? And how can we best deliver those kinds of things? I will say that from my own point of view, the whole notion of sort of computational thinking as a way to organize thinking in a way to kind of do things that a thing to learn about, so to speak. I think it's a tremendously important thing. It's something that should be sort of a core part of education. I mean, I see computational thinking as sort of a liberal arts kind of broad approach to things that really should be at the core of all kinds of education and sort of connected to this kind of foundational thinking about things from first principles, which is tremendously valuable in all sorts of areas, and I think becomes ever the more valuable as more and more of sort of the mechanics of what one has to do gets automated with computation and AI and so on, that it really becomes all the more important to be able to sort of think foundationally about things, to know a broad range of things, and to be able to sort of work out what to do next when much of the mechanics can sort of be delegated to AIs and so on. So, I think it's this sort of computational thinking, foundational thinking, these are really important educational directions. To what extent will existing educational structures kind of rise to the challenge of delivering that kind of education? I'm not sure. And certainly one can move faster by building something without sort of the institutional structures that exist there. Of course, there are features of education that are very much kind of intertwined with those institutional structures, whether it's in the US, being able to get student loans for accredited universities and so on, whether it's all sorts of other essentially sort of administrative and bureaucratic aspects of education, or even just the practicalities of having sort of younger students around and sort of dealing with the issues about that. That's a bunch of sort of structural administrative kinds of things. And so it's sort of long been a question that I've had is sort of what's the best way to take what we've learnt and be able to deliver it at an educational level. The summer school, the summer research program, and the various other programs that we have along those lines are things that are examples of how to deliver those things, but how do we scale that up? Do we expect that we will provide content which will go through, in a sense, other distribution channels? Like a couple of years ago now, started kind of a book and course on computational thinking. Unfortunately, I got a bit distracted with other things and I haven't gotten back to it. And that was sort of intended as a thing, sort of a generic college course for people who want to use computation anywhere, as sort of an introduction to being able to do that. And that's a thing where we're providing the core course, but we're expecting that it will mostly be distributed through existing universities and so on. The sort of alternative to that is that we try and provide the whole sort of verticalized education experience, which is what we're doing with things like our summer programs. But there's a question of sort of how do we extend that? Let's see. Okay, a couple of questions here. Luis is asking, have students ever taught you something surprising at the summer school? Absolutely. Every single year, I learn a ton of stuff at our summer school. That's part of what I really like about it. People come in with all sorts of different backgrounds, and I like to learn a lot of things from them. And as we start looking at different kinds of projects, they always sort of force me to think about things that I haven't thought about before. Sometimes I've kind of taken a project and I've sort of thrown it as hey, that's a thing I should think about sometime. This is a place where one can actually develop those projects. So for me, it's a great learning experience. I think it's a great learning experience for the students who come too, but I know for myself, it's a great learning experience. Yasha asked, what does the process look like to help students find a unique project that fits their interests and technology and so on? Well, okay, we've really developed quite a definite scheme for that. I mean, I think we ask, and now I'm this is sort of more on the administrative side of how this works, but I come up with a list of a few hundred projects. We distribute that to students and mentors. We ask students to, I don't remember what we're doing now for the summer school. We've changed this a bit over the years, but fundamentally we ask students to say, well, which projects from this list seem interesting to you? And maybe if you have a thing of your own to suggest, suggest that too. And then the students talk to the mentors they've been assigned. We usually make sort of initial mentor assignments, not me, but somebody makes those initial mentor assignments based on what seem like the interests of different students. And then I kind of do some meeting with groups of, I don't know, half a dozen students or something, and kind of go around the table and just have people talk about what they are interested in, have been doing, and want to do in the future. It's important to know what people's aspirations are, because that really is part of the story, is how do you make a project that sort of helps people reach their aspirations, so to speak. And then what we found over the years is the sort of the best scheme is after those meetings, it's like the mentors who've already talked to students, been there in those meetings, and me kind of try and talk about what would be a good project for each of these students. And then we kind of come back and try and present those projects to students. And most of the time, I think we probably have a more than 90% success rate of students saying, yeah, that's a good project. That seems interesting. I want to do that. Occasionally, it's like, oh, you kind of missed the point, and that project doesn't sound interesting, and then we have to sort of retry it. I will say that my experience has been when students come in saying, I've got this project, I really want to do this project, that's almost always not a good idea. It's actually pretty hard to scope a project that can really be done in 3 weeks, and to really assess, to know enough about the project to be able to sort of suss out enough about the student to be able to make a match that's actually going to work. And I think over the last 20-something years, I've gotten fairly good at that. And I think that what we see often is it actually is much easier to do that from the outside, at least with the experience we've got, than it is for students to come up with it for themselves from the inside. And it's usually there's a certain, yes, tell us the direction you're interested in, but our job is to figure out what actual project one should try to do over this 3-week period. And quite often those projects continue, but that's sort of, we want to get something where there's a definite end point that can be reached in 3 weeks. There are certain principles about finding projects that I've noticed. For example, projects that involve external data are usually a bad thing, because you spend all the time trying to sort of clean the data. Unless the data is already kind of pre-cleaned and in our data repository or something like this, that's kind of a bad idea for a project of that length, as an example. Another one that tends to be very questionable is ones where it's kind of like, well, there's this paper that sort of has been written and it's about this and that, and sort of understand that and connect it to this and so on, because it can then be, well, this paper is just either incomprehensible or nonsense or other sort of, afflictions that academic papers can have. So that's another one that one tends to avoid. I would say that, it's been a very interesting process over the years to learn how to develop projects that sort of fit in the framework that we've set up. Let's see. I'm just going to look here. Weasel is commenting, it's really nice to turn around and share education with others. They're thanking me for offering that. Yeah, I have to say, when I was younger, being a professor for a living, so to speak, I really wasn't interested in education. It's a terrible thing to admit. But I saw it as being, well, if you're, a professor and you do research and so on, education is sort of a necessary evil. I subsequently realized that education is a sort of tremendous way to educate yourself, in addition to being something that, for me, is a fulfilling process in its own right, so to speak. But it's been a funny journey for me because I have gotten sort of interested in the delivery of education. And obviously, in our products, we provide a lot of tools for education. I would say, for me personally, it is satisfying to deliver education and to sort of suggest projects to people. And I would say that we've had a whole bunch of really great success stories, particularly, I would say, with accelerating rate in recent years from our summer school and summer research program of people with very interesting sort of career trajectories that have developed from the things that they've done at our programs. And that's really, for me personally, it's a very fulfilling kind of thing to see. But I would say that in some respects, I would not claim that, although I like the kind of the giving aspect of education, I would say that sort of education is also selfishly a way for me to learn more things. And so it's sort of it has results in both directions. Let's see. Hills is asking, do you see a way for AI to deliver information to students with accurate information and references? The average student seems to use it to cheat these days. Well, I mean, certainly having sort of neural net AI systems, LLMs, and so on, be backed by the computational tools that we have, like Wolfram Alpha and Wolfram Language, that kind of removes a lot of and it produces nonsense part of things. For example, one of the things that we don't yet have out as a product, but is something where you're using the LLM as sort of the linguistic interface, but then you get these kind of Wolfram boxes, which are things where you see the input, you see the output, and that's a thing that's a piece of solid computation or solid curated knowledge that that you can count on. And maybe the input that the LLM produced for that is nonsense. You get to see that, but if the input is right, then the output will be right too. So that's a sort of a practical level there. There's the question of using AI in sort of more of a conversational chat mode as a way to actually do education. And I think I mentioned here before, we have a project that's been going for a while now to build kind of an AI tutor system that really can successfully kind of get to know students and provide education through sort of an AI interface, so to speak. And actually, we have the first such product is a tutor for Algebra 1. And in fact, just today, I was looking at what is the almost final version of this. So it should be coming out in the next few weeks. It is an attempt to have a system that can really do the whole thing of teaching algebra to a student. Do the whole thing as in answering all sorts of questions that a student might have in a sensible way, getting to know the student, providing sort of ways to adapt kind of the content of algebra to the particular interests of that student, being able to understand from the responses the student is giving what they really understand and what they don't, and being able to sort of adapt to that and provide the right sort of information to the student and so on. I don't know how it's going to work. It's, as I mentioned perhaps before, it's sort of the first time in the whole history of our company of 38 years now that we are putting out a product for which I am profoundly not in its target market. And, I learned algebra an outrageously large number of years ago. And it's pretty hard for me to kind of channel I'm just learning algebra for the first time to use this product. So it's a little bit of a scary thing for me that we're putting out a product where I can't sort of, with my own experience, sort of validate that this product is really a good thing. And in this case, there's about 70 years of kind of failures to do autonomous education with computers. This is a rather serious effort to overcome that and to really be able to provide something which can sort of autonomously teach initially algebra and then a whole bunch of other courses after that. So that's the thing that we're we'll be bringing out very soon, in the first version at least. Let's see. Gabriel asks, will the summer school ever travel and be held around the world? Oh, that brings back a painful memory for me. Summer school was first held actually at Brown University, because the person who was then the provost there was helped make that happen. And then it moved around. It moved to University of Vermont for a while. Then it moved, I'm trying to remember the sequence. But then in 2009, we had a really good setup to hold the summer school in Italy. And but we had sort of decided that and set everything up sort of 9 months in advance. 2009 happened to be the time that we were working to finish Wolfram Alpha. And of course, we predicted, oh, Wolfram Alpha will be finished way ahead of the summer school, but it wasn't. And so Wolfram Alpha came out May 15th of 2009, and that was just a few weeks before the summer school. And it was really quite a sort of a logistical nightmare, because Wolfram Alpha had just come out. There were a lot of technical issues, a lot of business issues, and I had sort of committed to being in Italy with, at that time, rather bad cell phone service and so on, and doing the summer school there. And it was really a mess. Didn't help that I got sick in the middle of the whole thing, which was something one couldn't have particularly expected or whatever. But it was really a logistical nightmare. And so after that, we sort of decided we really can't have the summer school where we have to say where we're going to do it 9 months in advance. We can't really set that up in a place where I wouldn't be able to sort of do other work if necessary, so to speak. So we tended to keep it fairly localized, well, mostly in New England. One time during the pandemic, we did it at our headquarters in Illinois, partly because at that time, the sort of regulations about COVID handling in Massachusetts was so onerous that it just wasn't realistic to do it there. But so I'd love to see the summer school sort of travel around, but it has been logistically really difficult. And we just don't want the possibility of kind of the same sort of situation that happened in 2009. My response to that has been very Pavlovian ever since. Let's see. LC asks, given the generality and genericity of taking a computational view of things, is it best deployed by particularizing it to each and every domain systematically, I see, or making it a sort of a general thing? In the K through 12 curriculum, people sort of say, well, you're learning math, you're learning science, you're learning English, you're learning whatever. It's bucketed in those kinds of ways. The fact is, I would like to think that if you learn computational thinking, you really can immediately apply it in other areas. Math, unfortunately, does not get applied so well in other areas, at least at the K through 12 level. Something like English, writing, yeah, it gets applied a bit more in other areas. I think one would like to see computational thinking be something which you probably have to have as a thing that gets taught, but that then there is a routine expectation that it be applied to other areas. I think in the case of college education, it's probably the case that you really have to have sort of a general introduction to computational thinking, if that hasn't happened earlier in sort of the educational path, and then expect that that introduction will be taken to all these other areas, just like writing essays might be taken to other areas. And just like in the college level, math gets taken to other areas. I think that that's the most realistic way to do it right now. Maybe that won't always be the way, but I think math is a good example. And while, engineering departments and things like this do sometimes teach their own math classes, possibly because they're dissatisfied with the kind of level of practicality of math that's taught by math departments. But I think this is a case where sort of like with math, where some sort of centralization of the teaching is relevant. I think that computer science, as it's currently configured, may not be the best home for computational thinking. Not clear what the best home is, but I don't think it's kind of something which sort of is slowly emerging in some places, some kind of computational sciences or something direction that isn't straight computer science. Straight computer science has had a weird history in academia, from sort of sometimes spinning out from engineering departments, sometimes from business schools, sometimes from different kinds of things. And really, it's ended up with a fair amount of, and now you want to be a software engineer type sort of practical programming stuff. And it's sort of had grafted onto it various sort of more intellectual pieces, whether it's computation theory, whether it's robotics, cryptography, machine learning, these kinds of things. And it's sort of a funny, it's a funny collection of things. I think the real core of what's important to teach is kind of computational thinking and how you apply sort of computational ideas in lots of different areas. But that's not really quite the mission of sort of computer science as it has so far evolved. And at the K through 12 level, oh, I think it's even more of a mess. I mean, there have been a series of sort of epochs where, first it was the basic programming language, then it was Pascal, then, oh gosh, I don't know whether I can go through the sequence, Java, etc. Of, this is what it means to do computer science, is to learn one of these low-level languages. And most of the takeaway ends up being, I think, from that, I find, it's all kind of boring for many students, just as that's a thing which people often have as the takeaway from not very good math teaching at the K through 12 level. I think that if one can get to teaching, computational thinking with computational language and be able to really apply computation to things that are sort of real world things about geography or about chemistry or about movies or whatever else, if one can really apply computation in these practical areas, I think it becomes a much more palatable and useful thing to teach at the K through 12 level. I mean, it has to be said also that sometimes computer science at some of these levels ends up being teaching about how to use a word processor, which is a fine and useful thing for people to know, but it isn't kind of the traditional view of kind of what it means to do sort of computational thinking. It's more like computational practicality, so to speak, of sort of getting around in the computational world. It's more kind of it's sort of the low-level practicalities of that. Let's see. Jess asked, do you think you could run your own university, maybe the first AI-led education center? Well, the thing with universities, people have said to me for many years, oh, you should do that. For me personally, not clear I'm the right person. I think that in terms of sort of the content of what might be taught and the strategy for how to do it, yes, I know a reasonable amount about that. But a lot of running a university is the very gritty operational details of making the whole thing work. And that's something, I built companies and things like that. I sort of know how that works. I would say that it's something where, as I was mentioning before, one of the problems is that universities are deeply intertwined with all sorts of regulatory stuff and bureaucracy, and also sort of the details of, if one's dealing with a university catering to young folk, the young folk can do crazy stuff, and somebody's got to deal with that, and it's all got to be set up so that people don't sort of game the system too much and so on. Those are not things that I'm so into. I might be into sort of the intellectual content of what should be done and kind of the strategy for how to set the thing up, but the sort of the gritty operational side of it is a different kind of thing. Um, and that needs a lot of energy and a lot of focus to achieve. I think in terms of sort of are there new opportunities for universities in the time of AI and so on? I think the answer is probably yes, to some extent. I think that a lot of what universities have come to stand for, particularly in countries like the US, is this sort of fully immersive experience for 4 years of a young person's life type thing, complete with the sports facilities and the clubs and the this and the that and the other and the dorms and all those kinds of things. And that's sort of a very that's a very different and hard to build institutional structure, sort of independent of the details of how education is delivered. I mean, clearly, as a practical matter, the tools we built, whether mathematical or Wolfram Alpha, Wolfram Language, have had lots of practical effect on the way that education is done across lots of existing universities. I think that taking the kind of education that we do at things like the summer school and scaling that up is an interesting direction, as I say, but I think it requires a team that is where I'm sort of more of a minor part of the story. So let's see. Gosh, Elsie asks, how early would you introduce your own kids to a computational view and approach as of today, given technology that exists with devices and AI and so on? I think it's always complicated because kids I have N equals 4. I have 4 kids, my own, so who are all kind of grown-ups by now. But they're all rather different, and they, have different. You kind of have to see what they're interested in to see when it's worth introducing this or that thing to them. And sometimes if you try and do it too early, it doesn't stick. And it's even sort of a bit of an exclusion principle that then they sort of think they've done that. And so then they don't come back to it later. And then they don't go in that direction, even though that might have been a good direction for them to go in. So, I tend to think that kind of things like our computational language it's kind of the 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds. That's the point at which kids start to be able to get it fairly well. I don't know, I'm curious to what extent there is sort of a matter of the pure, almost physiological development of human brains that allows one to sort of get things at particular ages. But my practical observation and experience has been that, one of my kids, I would say, started doing reasonably serious programming when he was like 7 or 8 years old. And he's gone on to be a very serious computational character, so to speak. But I would say generally 10, 11, 12 years old is sort of the age at which you can expect to sort of type things into a notebook, have things happen, sort of think about the world in a computational way. I don't know how useful it is to use kind of the sort of the play programming stuff of things like Scratch and so on earlier than that. I have to say my observation has been that whatever people do with that, it's sort of quite disconnected from what they do later on when they start being able to use tools that they could use for the rest of their lives, so to speak. I mean, I think for 11-year-olds or whatever, using our computational language is cool because they kind of know, and you can tell them, this is the same thing that all of those fancy scientists and other people like that are using. It's not a watered down version that was sort of built for kids. You're using the same kind of power tool that all the grown-ups are using. And I think that's a fairly powerful message that is quite inspiring to people. I think that it tends to be the case that these things where there's sort of a question of, when things like Logo, which was the precursor of Scratch, were introduced in the 1960s, 1970s, and so on, one of the big issues for education with computers was have people not be afraid of computers. Have it be the case that they feel empowered to actually type on a computer keyboard and have something happen and not think the computer is going to blow up. Well, that's simply not an issue for kids today because kids start using computers and so on at sort of close to t equals 0. And I don't think any kids are afraid of computers at this point. So that original reason for those kinds of have the computer do something for you and learn that computers don't blow up if you touch them, so to speak, has sort of gone away as a motivation. And I think nowadays it's much more, can you actually make a path where you start learning things at age 11 or something, and those things really keep building as you go through sort of later stages of education and your life. In terms of devices and computer games and so on, I mean, my n equals 4 sample is probably not typical, but I guess that my kids were never that obsessively interested in those things. I mean, some of these strategy games and some of these kind of more, I don't know, problem-solving type things they were somewhat into, but it wasn't. I think, trying to remember, I would say that there was none of this, oh, you shouldn't play that computer game, and none of this, oh, you should play that computer game. I think they sort of had a natural level of doing these things. In modern times, probably, well, I mean, at least 3 out of 4 of my kids have never been that interested in social media. So that's again something I can't speak to in a very serious way. I mean, I have to say that I think that sometimes my impression is that things get pretty reptilian out there in social media, particularly for kids, and that's a bit crazy. And it's it's hard for me to comment on what the best way to handle that is. Let's see. Oh boy, questions about kids. Lazy is asking, have your kids helped out with your business at all? Do you think that's valuable for them and you to be involved? Yeah, my kids have most definitely helped with my business and been involved. I think one thing that, I mean, partly I've been a work from home CEO for 30 something years. So my kids sort of have been exposed to that their whole lives. I think that it is sort of, it's pretty interesting for kids to see, for example, what happens when ideas go from it's just an idea to it's a real thing in the world. And certainly I shared with my kids a lot of things that we've been thinking about doing as a company. And sometimes I'll say, that's a really stupid idea. And it turns out it wasn't such a stupid idea. Sometimes they were right, it was a stupid idea. Actually, I was just remembering a story talking of kids and how they help with companies. My son Christopher, when he was 8 years old, was learning programming in our language and so on. And I remember one day he says to me, why is this was in 2006. So he says to me, why can't I just use plain English to get the computer to tell the computer what to do? Why do I need to write this code? And I'm like, well, it's difficult to make sort of plain English work that way, and it's very ambiguous. There are lots of different things, and he's like, but look, let me give you an example type thing. If you're trying to do this and this and this, there are only a limited number of ways to say that. Surely you can make a program that does this. Well, for other reasons, we were sort of thinking about something like Wolfram Alpha, but that was actually an important moment in convincing me that, yeah, this is really a thing one should think about. It really is not out of range to make something which has natural language input and does computation. So in a sense, Christopher was an important sort of initiator for the whole Wolfram Alpha project that was just getting started around that time. So that's a way that one of my kids contributed to kind of our business. But actually, in different ways. I would say that all of my kids have contributed to my business in and in some cases with business strategy advice, which has sometimes been rather good, even though I'm like, I think I really know this stuff, but somehow it's well, I happen to have at least one kid who's very talented at business kinds of things. Um, I think for people, I will say that having kids involved with what their parents do seems to me a very useful thing because the kids inevitably, likely genetically, otherwise in terms of environment, get a certain dose of kind of of imprinting from the parents, so to speak, and seeing how what they learn from the parents kind of plays out in what the parents do seems very useful. It seems like very useful data in a sense for the kids as they try and chart their own courses in the future. And I would say that even my kids who are not oriented, well, one of my kids who's a mathematician who wouldn't otherwise be very oriented towards sort of entrepreneurial kinds of things from having been exposed to those kinds of things. She's perfectly capable of doing those things, which the typical sort of math kid would not be. And so that's another example of kind of how having that sort of thing, being aware of that kind of thing, can be useful. I mean, I would say that I mean, there's a separate question which um, uh, is of the extent to which what one builds ends up being sort of a family business, and that's a more complicated question. I think at least one of my kids is pretty interested in our company and pretty and actually and has done lots of work with the company, and that's something that's I think good on all sides, but it's not it's very kid dependent whether that actually makes sense. Let's see, but I will say that I mean my kids also have been to uh, lots of kind of business meetings that I've had and things like this, and I think that's pretty interesting for them, and sometimes very useful for me. I'm reminded, okay, of uh, my son Christopher again at age maybe 13, um, sort of really wants to go to the annual Consumer Electronics Show, which is basically a gaggle of 200,000 grown-ups walking around and seeing trade show booths about all sorts of new things in consumer electronics. Anyway, so we go there. Christopher's, I don't know, 13, 14 years, I think 13 years old. And he was sort of the only kid among 200,000 adults. And that was a pretty interesting dynamic because he happened to look even younger than he was. And so, we're wandering up to these booths and people are talking to Christopher like he's a kid, but he happens to be he was a very informed kid. And so after some whole description of what this company do and things, Christopher would very politely, he's a very polite fellow, would ask, various kinds of questions. And the dynamic was just interesting because sometimes it would be literally, the person takes a step back and says, oh, well, yes, and then explains, oh, well, yes, some investor of theirs just asked that question too, and then they give some answer. But it was an interesting dynamic because, in a sense, the fact that so that they were initially had the thought that they were talking to a kid, sort of exposed more things than one have immediately got in a sort of standard, more immediate business conversation. But it was also just a very funny dynamic of the kind of the weird and unexpected kind of kid asking hard questions type thing. Luis asks, have your kids ever taught you anything? My kids have taught me an incredible amount of stuff. I would say that I don't know if they've learned from me, but I've sure learned a huge number of things from them, including things about myself, just from the fact that they are inevitably imprinted with some of my characteristics, and seeing those characteristics in other people teaches one a bunch about oneself. I mean, I'm often giving my kids a bit of a hard time because they're always like, we're very different from you. We're figuring everything out for ourselves type thing. And then, they'll be doing things which are shockingly similar to things that I've done. And I'll be sort of pointing out that the apple is not falling so far from the tree. And they'll kind of, at this point, they'll kind of reluctantly agree, so to speak. But it is kind of amusing that some of these things, which it's like, some of the things that I do with kind of keeping archives of things and so on, my kids have sometimes given me a hard time about how sort of obsessive and crazy that is. And then I discover that they're basically doing the same thing. And that's sort of interesting to see. Let's see. There's a question here. Well, there's a question maybe for a different live stream about stories about my first experience with computers. Let's do that in a different live stream. Let me see. Gosh. Okay, very different question here from Graby. How often do you pursue activities outside your norm? Is that a good habit to inspire new ideas in your own work? When I have opportunities to do things that are just kind of different, I often take them. For exactly the reason that I have found that really helps broaden my thinking about things. One typically there are all these different domains of activity in the world, and each one has a certain way of thinking about things. And unless you're sort of inside that activity, it's hard to get that way of thinking about things. So for me, it's pretty useful to sort of see different kinds of perspectives from doing different kinds of things. I mean, I will say, I get asked to give lots of kinds of talks and things like this, and I am much more likely to give a talk about something where somebody asks me to do it about some topic that I sort of peripheral to things I've ever thought about, and it's just kind of a thing which will be a different thing for me to think about and talk about. That's for me much more enriching than to just sort of talk about things I've talked about a zillion times. I don't know how. I mean, I'm trying to think of examples in recent times, but I've many times I've kind of done things which get me outside of what I normally do, so to speak. And sometimes well, like a bunch of educational things I've done with kids of different ages and so on, are definitely things which are very different from my usual kind of day job. Interacting with groups of middle school students and things is definitely different from tech CEOing, which is my day job, so to speak. And I find it really quite interesting to do these things that are sort of different in those ways. And I sort of thoroughly recommend it. I mean, sometimes the things you try to do aren't really a fit. There are things where there are activities I could imagine trying once, and then it's like, nah, that's not for me. And certainly an example, doing things like doing sort of public appearance type stuff and television programs, things like that, and news programs, whatever else. I've done that a few times. It's not for me. It's sort of interesting to see it, but as you might gather, for example, from these live streams, I'm not much of a short form, answer a quick soundbite question on a television program type person, and so that's kind of a not for me kind of thing. Then I could think of probably many other examples of things that have sort of turned out not to be for me, but it's kind of interesting to try it once or a couple of times and just see what happens, not least because then oh, that's really not for me, or, oh, actually, that thing that I didn't think I would find interesting is more interesting than I expected. let's see. Let's see. Kaylin asks, if you could version control your life decisions the way you do with code, what branches would you keep alive? Of kind of, well, you might have tried this and going in a different direction. I don't know. For me personally, it's complicated because there's what you choose to do in your life at the time when you choose to do it, and there's kind of how the world develops, and there's how you develop. There are things where I might say, I could have pursued that more, but I just wasn't interested at the time. And later on, I realized, oh, it's actually a very interesting thing. But I'm not even sure. So in that sense, keeping alive those directions, is sort of worthwhile. I mean, I suppose, for example, for me, I was an academic professor type long, long ago, and I've been a tech CEO for a long time now, doing intellectual things as a hobby, so to speak. And in modern times, I probably could have more closely combined professoring with tech CEOing. That's now something you can do. It wasn't something you could do, 40 years ago. And so I didn't do it at that time. But had that been more of a thing kept alive, maybe that would have been a thing that would have emerged at some point just because of the world changing. I suppose similarly, there are things where I was kind of doing things that I sort of decided weren't, well, okay, I'll give you an example. I spent the early part of the 1980s working on basic science and about complexity and things that became kind of my new kind of science effort and so on. And then in 1986, I kind of completely switched from doing that to starting our company, building mathematical Wolfram language, etc. And I really should have kept the other branch much more alive when I did that. I really made a definitive switch, and I literally to the point where I felt very guilty about it later. People were writing me letters. They were letters at the time, sort of saying, I want to come visit you and talk about sort of science and so on. I just didn't respond because I was just sort of in the direction. I'd just taken a different direction. And that was a case where I should have kept that other stuff more alive than I did. I kind of came back to it a few years later when I started working on basic science again. And then a decade later, I kind of re-entered kind of the community of people doing that kind of basic science. And I would say that many of those people, not because I hadn't responded to their mail, that didn't seem to be the issue at all, but they were kind of like, we thought you were gone. We didn't think you would come back as a sort of large, I don't know, gorilla or something, but as a big figure in our field again. We thought we had this field now, and you were out of it type thing, and that was that definitely generated some turbulence upon return, and that wouldn't have happened probably if I'd sort of kept that branch alive over the decade and a bit that I was mostly concentrating. Well, I was either doing that science sort of privately, or I was concentrating on other kinds of things. So and I think it is an interesting question. When you do projects, to what extent do those projects sort of have tails? To what extent do you do things to sort of maintain those projects? And to what extent do you just move on and do the next thing? I think people who are typically serial entrepreneurs, their typical mode of operation is you do a company, you sell it, you do the next company. And sometimes they bring some of the same people along, but sometimes it's just like, well, that was a period of 5 years of my life. And now I signed the documents, I sold the company, it's over, I move on to the next thing. And, for me, that hasn't been as satisfying as doing things where I feel like I'm building my whole life, one tower that's just getting taller and taller. But in some ways, it can be sort of a relief to just say, I'm done with that. Now I move on to the next thing, green field again. It's sort of a sense of freedom that one can get from doing that. I mean, I've had that a few times when I've done things like write books, like the new kind of science book, after a decade of working on that, eventually the book was done. And it's almost was confusing for me because I'm so used to software products where it's never done, where there's always more to add, more to upgrade, and so on. With the book, it was almost like, really, there's nothing more for me to do in this. It's out there, it's finished. It was a little strange. But also, I realized that in a case like that, the ideas in a book like that do require continued sort of kind of farming, continued sort of development, or continued presentation, at least, even if the core of the book is just what it is. So I think it's kind of a it's an interesting question. To what extent, and it's a very personality dependent thing, you want to do projects where they have an end. It's just finished. You left that job, you move to another one. Completely different things have to be done versus you're building something that's just sort of a progressive build that goes on for a long time. I mean, for example, when it comes to Wolfram language and Mathematica and so on, it's a never-ending story. I will not escape that in my whole life type thing. I'll continually be sort of dealing with will be dealing with that, at least I expect to. And that's something where, for some people, that feels like a crippling burden to say, I'm responsible for this thing. I've been responsible for it now for 38, 39 years, and, I'm going to go on being responsible for it. That seems like, oh my gosh, that's a terrible burden. But to me, that's more like I find that rather satisfying that, I put all this time into this thing and I built a thing that I can keep on building from. But it's a personality dependent thing, whether one prefers that or to be able to say, great, I'm free now. I can go off and do the next thing. The challenge sometimes is you've done one thing. For some people, you've done one thing and then, okay, I did that. The company I started, the job I did, it was successful. Okay, now I'm on to act two. What do I do? And sometimes that's a very difficult psychological thing because there's a great desire to make act two more impressive than act one. And it may be that act one, you were lucky, or it works better the first time you do things. The second time, it's kind of, you don't have quite that edge of energy necessary to really do it well. And it becomes a very frustrating thing. And it becomes a very sort of disappointing thing when act two doesn't end up outdoing act one, so to speak. And, I've seen many examples of people where sort of there's act one and then act two is sort of a redoing of act one, but it's supposed to be bigger and better, but it doesn't make it to be bigger and better. I have to say, in situations where people are doing that, for many people, I think it's better to have, act two, act three, and so on, be somewhat different from act one. It's kind of a lot like, oh, let's do the same thing again, but do it a bit better. Now, having said that, sometimes you have an opportunity to do act two and you'll know what you're doing because you just did act one, and act two really is better. I mean, that happened to me with companies and building products because I started my first company in 1981, building a thing called SMP, which was in many ways a forerunner of Mathematica and Wolfram language. But that company, which sort of went off in different directions, and I kind of peeled off from it. And also the technology that had been built with SMP had a bunch of good ideas, but a bunch of pretty bad ideas as well. And so I sort of had an opportunity to do a version one, which for all kinds of reasons, both technical and business, sort of I had disconnected from. And then when I was like, well, I really need something like this, and doing sort of version two in 1986 or so, I was able to learn from version one and sort of do the right thing first time. And that was pretty successful. I mean, I think there's a common aphorism, plan to throw one away. Once you've done something the first time, you really know what you're doing, and then you can do it right the second time. And then the other part of that aphorism is you never will, because if it has to be a special set of circumstances that the sort of version one is that you still have the energy to do a version two, and that version one is kind of somehow you don't that you end up throwing the version one away, so to speak. I think I mentioned a couple of times, I was really struck recently. My first company, which sort of made the mistake of bringing in, probably the mistake at the time of bringing in sort of other people to run the business operations of the thing. And it sort of segued into a direction very different from the one that I had sort of started it on. And back in maybe 1982, 1983, under pressure from venture capitalists, it went in the trendy direction of the time, which was then artificial intelligence. Part, I don't know what it was, 2, 3, or whatever it is, but certainly an earlier part than the modern success. And at that time, it was mostly building expert systems kinds of things. And the company actually changed its name to Inference Corporation, which sounds extremely modern, but that was 1982 or so. And eventually the company went public in the mid-1990s in a rather undistinguished IPO. And I learned just recently, because I'd never really paid attention to this, that at the time when Inference Corporation went public, it was actually smaller than Wolfram Research was at the same time. Which I kind of had this view in my mind that, I brought in all these business people and there was all these investors and all this kind of thing, that somehow that company, while it might not be very interesting to me, was at least bigger than the company that I had built that was much more interesting to me, but it turns out it wasn't. So in any case, this whole question about sort of whether you set your life up to be building these very, very large structures that you keep on being responsible for and building on top of, or whether it's more like I do a thing, then I move on to the next thing. Different people prefer different things. I think I mostly prefer, I prefer the global kind of building of large towers, but the local, here's a thing, it's a product, we finished it, there's version 1. Or it's a book, I finished it. Okay, I'm going to write another book at some point, but I finished sort of a definite thing. I will say, for example, in academia, there's a tremendous tendency to write one paper, then write another one that's a follow-on, another one that's a follow-on, 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 follow-on. I absolutely hate that. And I have tried really hard to avoid that. Because what I found is that if I'm working on some project, then I build up a whole bunch of energy around that project. And I'm excited about that project. And then you kind of, I push to really make that project as good as possible, make it, the best sort of post that I can write, the best book that I can write, whatever. And then, I've reached this peak. And for me, it's really kind of painful. And I don't, I try to avoid doing it to do, oh, and now there's a follow-on. It's like I wanted to put everything I could say about that topic. I want to put down once and for all, and then I'm going to move on to a different topic. And I'm not going to be sort of tweaking that first thing that I did. And even within Wolfram language, it's like we build out an area and then we're building out another area. And in that case, it's a little different because it's not me sort of directly being the one who's adding sort of the extra pieces to things. I was going to mention something about sort of the psychology of projects and about sort of once you did Act 1 and maybe Act 1 was fairly successful, how you sort of deal with Act 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. And I think for myself, I have a really simple principle, which is I never think about sort of how big, how important is this project going to be relative to any other project I've done. At any given time, a project that I'm doing, I tend to be excited about that project. And I'm not thinking about it, how does it compare to other projects? I certainly have learned from what's happened with other projects and tried to learn from the successes and non-successes of other projects. But for the project I'm doing, I'm like, I'm doing this project. I think it's cool. I think it's interesting. I'll do it the best I can. But it's not like, and is this project going to feel like it is the sort of crowning achievement relative to other projects? Partly, that's just because I'm more interested in doing the project and then thinking about sort of the significance of the project. But also, I would say that even if I look at it from the outside, the relative significance of projects I've done has been very hard to predict, as it is with everybody. And I think it's really just a question of do the project the best you can, be excited about it while you're doing it, and don't sort of worry about the long view of the project in terms of sort of history, not least because, well, projects often morph as they get developed. And it's just hard to tell what's going to be significant and what's not. And sometimes things seem insignificant for years, decades, and then they become very significant later on. And it really, I mean, I've had a pretty good run in terms of that kind of thing, that the things I've done have tended to become progressively more significant, which is sort of a satisfying thing because it's like things I did in the 1980s. People are like, oh, well, this is really cool now in the 2020s, so to speak. And it's like, didn't you notice that in the 1980s? Well, that's not really the thing to ask. It's just the way that things develop that that happens. But it's nice when it does. It's better than the other possibility, which is people the that you do a project and then progressively over time that project becomes less and less relevant. Des is commenting, one thing about getting older is you realize you're far more like your parents than you were previously willing to believe or accept. Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I mean, I notice with people that people, particularly in sort of the modern education tracks, people, they grow up with their parents, whatever, and then they go off to college and they're like in a different world and they're sort of adopting different directions and so on. And then by the time they're in their 40s or something, they're back being much more similar to their parents. And it's sort of it's a curious thing to see. Now, of course, that the thing that breaks that pattern is when the circumstances of one generation are very different from the circumstances of another, or when the world is very different, and the kinds of things that are possible are very different in one generation versus another. But yes, I do tend to agree that that you see that phenomenon a lot, and it's always interesting to try and learn from what one's parents did, what one thinks they did right, what one thinks they did wrong, those kinds of things. It's a very useful data point. It's kind of like seeing oneself sort of whatever it is, 30, 40 years, ahead, so to speak. What happens, you can use that to help sort of guide your own course. Let's see. Elsie comments, when already in one project, how do you manage the inevitable excitement about other projects that arise so that you can bring your projects to a close as fairly regularly as I do? I think I'm a fairly tenacious person. And I think I'm kind of very used to the idea that I have projects kind of in the wings. They're projects that are kind of awaiting development, and I'm kind of learning a bit about, and I'm thinking about occasionally, and I'm talking to people about, but I haven't really engaged on them. And I think it's very useful to have sort of these premonitions of projects, perhaps even decades ahead of when one actually does them, but to not kind of be starting to spend real time on them. And I think that's probably the way that I avoid kind of getting my excitement dragged off into chasing the next shiny object. I mean, from having managed a lot of talented people for many years, there are definitely people who are into the shiny object chasing business, and where it takes a lot of effort to get them to just stick to the project that you're doing now, try and finish that one before it's like, oh, look at this really cool thing that we could do over here. I would say for myself, I would say that the satisfaction of finishing projects probably overrules the kind of desire to chase the next shiny object. I also feel like when I haven't finished a project, when I have a project kind of hanging over me, unfinished, I feel like I find that very uncomfortable. So I feel that I really do want to get the thing finished so that I don't have something sort of hanging over me. Something's very, very nice for me the last, particularly 5 years, has been that a lot of projects that I sort of had meant to do for decades, I finally have done. And that's a really cool feeling. And I thoroughly recommend it. You might think, oh, it's a project I meant to do for 40 years. It's too late, never going to do it. But for me, whether it's our physics project, whether the things I've been doing about biological evolution recently, a whole bunch of other projects, things about second order thermodynamics and so on, these are projects that I had intended to do for many decades, and finally had the tools and sort of the way of thinking to be able to do them. And it's really satisfying to get them finished. And I thoroughly recommend it. Cosmic is commenting, one project usually generates many appealing tangents. Yes, indeed. And for me, I try to, for example, when I was working on the New Kind of Science book, I put many tangents into notes at the back of the book. But I knew that my matrix was I'm writing a book, it's going to have, a main text, it's going to have notes in the back. Anything I do has to fit into that matrix. And I really do try and make an active effort to not think about sort of out of matrix kinds of things. Like, for example, I could imagine, oh, I don't know, like a quintessential example was ages ago. I'd set up a treadmill to be able to, type on a computer with it. And everybody said that was impossible. It wasn't too hard to arrange, etc. And it was kind of like, well, maybe I should turn that into, patent a product or whatever else. And it's like, no, I just don't have the matrix to do anything useful with something like that. I should not pursue that. But also there are other cases where people say, why aren't you making inventions about all kinds of things? Well, I certainly could. I have lots of it's easy for me to have ideas in different directions, but I just don't feel like I have anything to do with them. And it's just sort of frustrating to have ideas where they're just going to be, well, I'll never be able to do anything with that. So I tend not to do that. Now, I will say that in many cases, and you probably see that in these live streams, when I start talking about something, yes, there are many, many tangents one gets led down. And the but that's a somewhat different thing. When it's a project, I like to think, what is the sort of matrix that this project is embedded in? I can write a certain number of kind of extra notes in some piece of thing I'm writing or something like this, or I can add a certain amount of extra features to some product I'm developing. But there's a limited domain of things you can do. And it's like control yourself to not start doing things where they fall off the matrix and you couldn't really do anything with them, even if you put effort into them. Let's see. Bersin is asking, how can one regain faith in academia amid the impending wave of AI? What will be the role of universities? Will the publish or perish culture transform into no manuscript, just give me the data? Well, that's an interesting question. Certainly at the present time, the idea of sort of papering things by sort of writing up this narrative description, yeah, an AI can do that. It might not do it as well as some humans can do it, but it can do something along those lines. And certainly we put effort into it. Look, we wrote a whole paper and that proves we put effort in. That's kind of not really going to cut it going forward. The question of how academia should evolve, there are really two branches. One part of it is the educational mission. The other part of it is the research mission. The educational mission we talked about a little bit earlier today is sort of teaching people to think, seems to me to be the number one thing, and teaching people a certain number of facts about the world. Those both seem to be very worthwhile things to achieve and to do, and not going away anytime soon. AI can help with those things, but the core mission, in my opinion, should be teaching to think and teaching things and teaching knowledge, so to speak. And that's a perfectly valid mission. Universities may have lost track in some respects of that mission and gone off on various kinds of social missions and things like this, which I think are somewhat orthogonal to the just teach stuff mission. I think that that mission, in my view, is kind of a good and alive and well mission. When it comes to research, it's a more complicated story because often fields, research, and so on becomes a victim of its own success. Things go well, and so sort of funds are poured in, more and more people go into the area. It becomes this giant institutionalized thing, and the vast majority of what's done is deeply incremental. The vast majority of what's done is just a small step forward, where occasionally people will come along and they can take a very big step forward. That's the equivalent of 1,000 papers or something that other people will write. Is it worth writing all those incremental papers? Well, sometimes they're part of the educational mission, and that makes perfect sense. Sometimes also they just provide sort of the raw material that ends up eventually getting used in some sort of serious step forward. But there certainly is a fair amount of what goes on in academia where, I look at the papers and I kind of roll my eyes because it's kind of like, I don't know, why did anybody do this? If this was to educate a student, great. That makes sense. I'm good. I understand it. If it was just to sort of turn the crank because, by golly, somebody is supposed to churn out such and such a number of research papers, it's like this is an unfortunate thing that the world has come to a point where that's what's going on, where it's sort of the papers are being produced just for the sake of the papers, so to speak, rather than for the sake of some kind of overall expansion of knowledge or even education of a particular person. If it's just like, well, what I do for a living is I produce 5 papers a year, and what I see sometimes in academia, actually too often in academia, is sort of the can I make a paper out of it? That's all I care about. And sort of the mechanics of I make the paper, I put in citations to the people who will accept my paper in a peer review process. I do, I game the whole thing. And it's like it feels like a horribly pointless thing. Now, I have thought for a long time that computational journals where the code is there, the data is there, you can really build from the sort of the things that the people built their paper from, rather than just read their words, that those kinds of computational journals, computational papers were really valuable. I mean, I started pushing that idea in the 1980s, and it's still not there. We built technology from 35 years ago with notebooks and so on, and with Wolfram language to be able to do this and do it really well. And I think, in the things that I write myself, I always make sure that any picture that I have, you click it, you get the Wolfram language code, you can run it, it will reproduce that picture. It's a tremendously valuable thing. Like at our summer programs, that's a place where people can start from to be able to build the sort of the next step, so to speak, and similarly outside in the research world in general. But people have been very reluctant to do this for a couple of reasons. One, it's hard work to actually make a piece of code that you can put in your paper that's elegant and that works and so on. That's hard work. It's much easier to spin some words and just sort of say it this way, that way, the other way. You don't have to, there's no sort of accountability to make sure it actually works, so to speak. That's one thing. The other thing is that sometimes people feel like, well, it makes it too easy for other people to sort of take the next step. And particularly in the mode of academia where you're doing sort of serial publication. I'm going to write 50 papers about this one topic. It's like, well, I want the tools to build all those 50 papers. I don't want to give them to other people because then they'll be able to outrun me writing those 50 papers. That, for somebody like me, is not really an issue because I'm trying to write one thing, and then that's my thing about that topic. And anything else that gets done, it's like over to you, rest of the world, to get that done. So for me, it's the best thing to do is to expose the tools as much as possible so that people can go and take the next step, because I'm not going to do that. But it's a little bit of a different dynamic in some areas of academia, many areas of academia. And when it comes to sort of raw data, it's like, I just spent 20 years collecting this data. I don't want other people to go off and find all the juicy things from this data. I want to make use of this data myself for the next 20 years or whatever. So there are things like that, which you can see why individual academics would have those points of view. But in the aggregate, the fact that it hasn't really developed, the computational papers thing hasn't really developed in a proper way, and particularly not with Wolfram language, which is sort of the unique case where the actual code you write is part of the exposition. If it's well-written code, it kind of helps carry the message. It's not just, oh, there's a piece of code for a computer, it carries the message for other people who read it. You read the code and you see what somebody is really trying to say. It's kind of a more precise version of you look at the math formula and you see what people are trying to say. I should go back to my day job here. Let's see, maybe just one more question. That's always a mistake, but let's just see if there's anything that builds directly on what we've talked about here today. All right, I'm just going to take one more and then I got to go. I'm being very bad here. I really should be going to do my day job. But one from Nova. Is it true that some people just are not good at math? I don't know. That's the direct answer. I will say that people who are good at math, people who are really good at math, like are successful research mathematicians, have a remarkable diversity of different kinds of ways of thinking about things. From the very formalistic, kind of, very structured, to the very impressionistic, kind of big intuition kinds of things, to the ones who can solve a problem quickly, to the ones who couldn't, to save their life, kind of, win some math competition, but who come up with deep ideas that sort of build in a big research direction and so on. So at the level of very high performing mathematicians, there's a great diversity in the kinds of skills that people have. Now, when it comes to, are there people who just never get the abstraction of math? I have to say I doubt that. I have to say I think it's a matter of how they get taught. I mean, I don't know that for sure. I have had the experience, for example, with kids trying to explain things, and sort of fortunately or unfortunately, it ends up that the groups of kids I end up interacting with end up getting getting rather selected for high performing kids. So that means that it's probably, my sample is not as good as it might be. But I feel like, sometimes you try and explain something to people, and there's a way it's done in math education. And there are people who just won't get it. Just like at the level of fancy research mathematicians, there are ones who you explain things one way, they'll be like, oh yeah, I get it. You explain things another way, they won't get it. I mean, and I think that sometimes I feel like, there's this particular template for how to explain things in math education. And yeah, there are different kinds of math education, but in the end, they're all fairly similar. And I kind of have the suspicion that there may be people where, look, there's a way you can get to those concepts, and people will absolutely be able to wrap their arms around those concepts, but you won't get to them the same way that sort of traditional math education gets to them. They'll always seem to people too abstract. It's like, I don't get it, I don't understand. I mean, I think, one of the things that tends to be a dividing line of people learning math is, can you add fractions? Well, I am skeptical that it's really the case that there are people who just will never get it. I think it's really a question of how it's explained and so on. And there's a great tendency to start explaining it in this very mechanistic way where, because you're just trying to get the person to pass the test. And so it's you move this to that, and it's there's a crisscross of that, and I don't know, there's a whole mnemonic for doing this and that, and it's incomprehensible. But and people may have a very hard time following those directions, so to speak. But I have to say, maybe I'm just a kind of an optimist. The that well, okay. It's also worth describing what one means by being good at math. Weasel points out it's okay to not be good at math because we have calculators and computers. That's absolutely right. I mean, when it comes to the low-level mechanics of math, there's you can just use a machine to do it. But there are concepts of math that are really worthwhile. I mean, there are concepts of systematic thinking that math kind of teaches that are really worth learning. And I think that those kind of concepts are, that's what's worth getting out of math. And also some intuition for how you work things out is worth getting out of math. There's also a separate branch, which is kind of learning something about sort of an important piece of the cultural history of our civilization, which is what's been constructed in math and the things people have thought about with math. But I think that what I was really addressing was, is it the case that people sort of don't get the abstraction of math and just sort of never get to the point where they can reach that level of abstraction? I am skeptical, but I might be wrong. I mean, that I tend to feel like that's a thing where people can get to it. I'll just say one last thing about sort of basic arithmetic math. When I was a kid, I was pretty bad at that stuff. I mean, for a long time, okay, silly story about myself. When I was 7 years old, I guess, I was supposed to be learning multiplication tables, but the school I was at had some whole sort of competition where they have kids in a line and they'd go through asking them random multiplication questions. And I learnt that if you knew just one multiplication fact, 7 times 8 is 56, that you could sort of win this game much of the time because most people wouldn't know that fact. And so wherever you are in this line, you would always jump to the front because you knew that fact and nobody else did. And so for many years, all kinds of multiplication facts, I just didn't know. I knew that one. I didn't know 6 times 9. I wouldn't know a bunch of other ones. In fact, I'm having a hard time. Okay, I get that one now. But it's sort of funny for me because I have a pretty decent memory. And so over the years, I would slowly fill in, different parts of the multiplication table that I learned and realize how very rarely I needed to use these things. But in any case, that's I think I was answering a different question about good at the abstraction of math rather than good at the mechanics of math, which are two very different things. Anyway, I should go. Thank you for joining me, and thanks for a bunch of interesting questions. And I look forward to talking with you another time. Bye for now.